The Blue Whale Challenge. The story of the so-called Blue Whale Challenge begins in an unlikely place. The murky corners of Russian social media in the early 2010s, at a time when the internet was transforming from a tool of connectivity into a vast and often dangerous frontier. What emerged was a blend of rumor, tragedy, and moral panic, an online phenomenon that would become one of the most controversial and misunderstood digital dangers of the decade. Though many aspects of the story were exaggerated, misreported, or distorted by fear, certain elements remain chillingly real: young lives lost, communities left in mourning, and a stark reminder of how the internet can amplify both myths and risks. The earliest whispers of what became known as the Blue Whale Challenge surfaced in Russia around 2013 and 2014. The Russian social network Contact, often compared to Facebook, was home to various closed groups catering to teenagers who were fascinated by dark themes: depression, nihilism, suicide, and self-harm. These groups often used melancholic images, moody skies, abandoned buildings, and artwork tinged with death. Inside these digital spaces, administrators sometimes encouraged vulnerable young people to express their feelings of alienation. Yet in the midst of these communities, something more sinister began to take shape. Allegedly, certain group leaders pushed participants into a so-called game that asked them to complete tasks over the course of 50 days. Each day brought a new assignment, ranging from seemingly harmless acts like listening to specific music at night or watching horror films, to increasingly disturbing requests: carving symbols into the skin, standing on rooftops, waking at 4:20 a.m. The ultimate task, according to reports, was to commit suicide. By 2015, Russian media had begun reporting clusters of teenage suicides, many of which were rumored to be linked to these online groups. The name Blue Whale itself is thought to have emerged during this period. Some claim it referenced the phenomenon of whales beaching themselves, a tragic, seemingly voluntary act of self-destruction. The metaphor caught on quickly, a haunting image that encapsulated the supposed purpose of the game. Journalists began writing about a shadowy network of curators who preyed upon vulnerable teenagers, manipulating them into taking their own lives. The stories were both horrifying and strangely compelling, sparking public outrage and drawing the attention of law enforcement. One of the most central figures to emerge in these reports was Philip Budeikin, a psychology student from Russia who would later be convicted in connection with encouraging minors to commit suicide online. Budeikin became widely portrayed as the mastermind of the Blue Whale Challenge, though the reality was more complex. In interviews following his arrest in 2016, he appeared to revel in the notoriety, claiming he was cleansing society by convincing those he deemed unworthy to end their lives. Russian courts sentenced him to prison, and his case was used as proof that something dangerous had indeed been taking place online. However, even while Budeikin's guilt was documented, questions lingered about the scale of the problem. Was this truly a widespread organized game ensnaring thousands, or a combination of isolated tragedies, manipulative online figures, and an exaggerated media narrative? What is certain is that multiple suicides in Russia during 2015 and 2016 were linked, at least in part, to online groups associated with the themes central to Blue Whale. Parents who lost their children spoke about finding clues in journals or on computers. References to a whale, drawings of ocean creatures, or mentions of online challenges. Investigators uncovered networks of accounts encouraging dark thoughts and offering step-by-step tasks. Russian news outlets, hungry for shocking stories, amplified these findings with sensational headlines. Soon, the story spread beyond Russia's borders. By late 2016 and early 2017, international media outlets began reporting on the Blue Whale Challenge as a global menace. In India, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Brazil, authorities connected cases of youth suicides to the challenge, though direct evidence was often thin. In many instances, police admitted that while the victims were active online and sometimes mentioned games or challenges, there was no concrete proof of their participation in a centralized program. Still, The pattern was enough to spark fear. Teenagers dying in similar ways, often with cryptic notes or digital traces that seemed to suggest influence from strangers on the internet. The fact that the story was difficult to fully prove only seemed to make it more frightening. One of the earliest confirmed international cases was that of a young girl in Brazil in 2017, whose death was investigated in connection with the challenge. Brazilian authorities reported finding conversations between the victim and unknown online contacts instructing her to perform dangerous tasks. In India, police issued warnings after several teenagers were reported dead under circumstances their families linked to blue whale. Among the most publicized cases was the death of a 14-year-old boy in Mumbai in July 2017, who reportedly jumped from a building after allegedly engaging in the challenge. His friends told investigators he had mentioned the game, and his schoolmates said he had discussed the final stage. Though some experts cautioned against jumping to conclusions, the incident triggered a wave of panic across India, with schools and governments issuing urgent advisories to parents. What complicated the story further was the role of the media itself. As newspapers, television stations, and online outlets raced to report each new death, they often repeated unverified claims, conflated unrelated suicides, or relied heavily on speculation. Headlines proclaimed that the Blue Whale Challenge had claimed dozens, then hundreds of lives worldwide. Social media platforms became flooded with posts warning parents, sharing alleged lists of tasks, and claiming inside knowledge of the game. Some teenagers even began pretending to be curators themselves, sending messages to peers with threatening instructions. In many cases, these were pranks, but in others, they caused genuine psychological harm. The line between myth and reality blurred, leaving communities unsure of what was true but deeply fearful nonetheless. For those families who had lost children, the impact was devastating regardless of the wider debate. In Russia, parents described their children's descent into secretive online behavior, staying awake until early morning hours, and suddenly withdrawing from family life. In India, mothers and fathers recalled the confusion of seeing their child seemingly happy one week, only to fall into unexplained despair and end their life the next. Whether or not a centralized game was orchestrating these events, it was undeniable that online spaces provided opportunities for predators, bullies, or manipulative individuals to exploit vulnerable youth. The deaths, the grief, and the unanswered questions were tragically real. By early 2017, Russian authorities reported that they were investigating dozens of suicide cases linked to online groups associated with Blue Whale. They announced crackdowns on administrators of these groups, arresting multiple suspects in addition to Budaikin. Lawmakers introduced stricter regulations for harmful online content, particularly material that could encourage self-harm. Other countries soon followed with similar warnings and investigations. Schools sent letters home urging parents to monitor their children's internet use, while police departments around the world issued statements encouraging vigilance. At the same time, psychologists and child protection experts stressed the importance of nuance. They warned that while the Blue Whale Challenge represented a disturbing example of online exploitation, the broader issue of teenage mental health and suicide could not be reduced to a single online trend. Vulnerable youth were at risk not simply because of one so-called game, but because of untreated depression, isolation, bullying, and the absence of strong support systems. For these professionals, the panic surrounding Blue Whale risked overshadowing the deeper problems that needed to be addressed. Yet for the public, the image of a dangerous internet game luring children to their deaths was a narrative that was difficult to ignore. As the story spread to Europe and North America, authorities there also faced questions. Were local teenagers engaging in the challenge? Or was this primarily a Russian phenomenon amplified by global media? In the United States, law enforcement agencies reported investigating cases where teenagers mentioned Blue Whale, though most turned out to be hoaxes or instances of self-harm unrelated to the game. In the United Kingdom, similar reports surfaced, prompting schools to warn parents, though again, verifiable links remained rare. Still, the fear itself was impactful. Even in the absence of widespread confirmed cases, the challenge became synonymous with the hidden dangers of online life. Through 2016 and 2017, the narrative of the Blue Whale Challenge continued to evolve. More cases were reported in Latin America, particularly in Chile and Colombia, where teenagers were said to have been coerced by online contacts. In some of these cases, authorities did confirm exchanges between victims and individuals pushing harmful instructions. Yet the numbers remained far smaller than sensational headlines suggested. While early claims spoke of hundreds of deaths directly caused by blue whale, careful investigations revealed that many reported cases were either unrelated suicides or unverified rumors. Still, the phenomenon had already taken on a life of its own. By now, the Blue Whale Challenge was both a real and symbolic threat, a dangerous mix of fact, fiction, and fear that highlighted how vulnerable young people could be manipulated in the digital age. The first half of the story closes with a haunting contradiction. On one hand, the existence of manipulative online figures like Philip Budeikin, the tragic deaths of multiple confirmed victims, and the exploitation of vulnerable youth were undeniable. On the other hand, the scale of the phenomenon was far less than the global panic suggested. Yet in a sense, the panic itself became part of the problem. By sensationalizing the story, the media spread awareness of the Blue Whale Challenge to millions of teenagers who might otherwise never have heard of it. Some were drawn in by curiosity, others by fear, and a few by the very despair that made them susceptible in the first place. Thus, the cycle continued, rumors feeding into reality, tragedies feeding into myth. As 2017 unfolded, the story of the Blue Whale Challenge surged across borders, carried on a tide of sensational headlines and anguished reports of teenage deaths. What had begun as a Russian phenomenon tied to online suicide groups was now a subject of international panic. In South Asia, Latin America, and parts of Europe, families, schools, and governments braced for what they believed was a coordinated effort to push children into taking their own lives. In truth, what was happening was far more fragmented and complicated, yet no less troubling. Vulnerable teenagers were indeed encountering dangerous online influences, though whether these influences formed a single organized game or a series of scattered pranks, manipulations, and dark communities remained unclear. Regardless, the results could be deadly. India was one of the first countries outside of Russia to confront the challenge directly. In July 2017, the suicide of a 14-year-old boy in Mumbai shocked the nation. He reportedly jumped from the terrace of a building, and his classmates claimed he had spoken about reaching the final stage of the Blue Whale Challenge. Although investigators did not find definitive digital evidence linking him to the game, the incident triggered widespread alarm. Within weeks, additional reports emerged of teenagers in West Bengal, Kerala, and Madhya Pradesh engaging in dangerous behaviors believed to be connected to blue whale. In some cases, students were found with self-inflicted injuries or had mentioned the challenge in conversations with peers. Schools began issuing warnings, and police across multiple states announced investigations. The Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology even sent notices to major tech companies, including Google, Facebook, and WhatsApp, ordering them to remove all links or references to the challenge. In Brazil, similar concerns were unfolding. Authorities connected the deaths of several teenagers to possible involvement with blue whale, and in some instances, investigators confirmed that victims had been in contact with anonymous online figures encouraging self-harm. A case in Paraíba, northeastern Brazil, in early 2017 involved a 16-year-old girl whose phone records showed conversations with individuals giving her harmful instructions. The revelations fueled fear throughout the country, with police urging parents to carefully monitor their children's online activities. Television programs and newspapers devoted extensive coverage to the topic, often highlighting the most terrifying elements of the supposed game. The result was a mix of genuine awareness and widespread hysteria, leaving many families unsure of how to protect their children in the digital age. Latin America saw further reports in countries like Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. In Chile, police opened investigations into suspected blue whale groups operating online, warning that local teenagers were being targeted. In Argentina, media outlets reported multiple cases of students either attempting self-harm or confessing to being approached by supposed curators. In Colombia, the suicide of two teenagers in 2017 was linked by some outlets to the challenge, though authorities cautioned against drawing premature conclusions. Still, the pattern was similar everywhere. Clusters of tragic incidents, often involving teenagers struggling with emotional difficulties, layered with the unsettling possibility that online manipulation had played a role. Europe, too, was not untouched. In the United Kingdom, schools began warning parents about the blue whale challenge after reports surfaced of children being contacted online with threatening messages. The National Crime Agency investigated several cases, but found little evidence of widespread activity. Most incidents appeared to involve hoaxes or isolated cases of online bullying. Nevertheless, the warnings spread quickly through parent networks, fueled by Facebook posts and WhatsApp chains claiming that children were at risk. In France, media outlets reported on similar fears, with parents alarmed after hearing about the challenge from sensational news reports. In Germany and Spain, police issued public statements advising caution, but also urging against panic, emphasizing that while teenagers were sometimes being targeted with harmful content online, the scale of the blue whale challenge itself was not as massive as some reports suggested. The United States experienced its own wave of concern. By mid-2017, local police departments from Florida to California had issued statements warning about the challenge, often in response to reports from parents or schools. In many cases, the supposed incidents turned out to be hoaxes or misinterpretations. Some teenagers claimed to have been contacted by curators, but investigations revealed these were pranks by peers or unrelated instances of cyberbullying. Still, the idea of a hidden online game luring American children to suicide was enough to capture public attention. News stations ran alarming segments, schools sent letters home, and community meetings were held to discuss internet safety. The fear itself became a force shaping how families, teachers, and law enforcement approached the issue of online risks. As the panic spread, psychologists, suicide prevention experts, and media analysts began pushing back against the more extreme claims. They pointed out that while blue whale did exist in some form, there were documented cases of individuals like Philip Budeikin exploiting vulnerable teenagers. The idea of a massive, coordinated global game with thousands of victims was largely a myth. Many reported suicides linked to blue whale had no direct connection to the challenge. Instead, the phenomenon often acted as a lens through which existing tragedies were interpreted. When a teenager took their own life, families and communities, desperate for answers, sometimes pointed to blue whale even without evidence. The narrative provided a chilling but simple explanation for something far more complex: the devastating realities of depression, mental illness, family conflict, and emotional isolation. Researchers studying the phenomenon also noted the role of moral panic in amplifying the story. The media's sensational coverage often outpaced verified facts, creating a feedback loop. Each reported case was linked to blue whale, which in turn reinforced the belief that the challenge was widespread. This cycle made it difficult to separate fact from fiction. In effect, the fear of blue whale became as dangerous as the challenge itself, because it spread awareness of the idea to countless young people who might otherwise never have heard of it. Some were drawn in by curiosity, others by despair, and still others by the thrill of testing boundaries. Online pranksters took advantage of the hype, posing as curators and sending messages to peers, thereby giving the illusion that the challenge was everywhere. Despite the exaggeration, real harm did occur. The psychological vulnerability of teenagers meant that even the idea of being involved in something like blue whale could be damaging. Experts pointed out that exposure to detailed media coverage of suicide can create a contagion effect, known as the Werther effect, where publicity around suicides increases the likelihood of copycat incidents. by publishing detailed accounts of blue whale tasks and alleged victim stories. Some media outlets may have unintentionally contributed to the spread of harmful behaviors. For this reason, organizations such as the World Health Organization urged caution in reporting, emphasizing that suicide should never be sensationalized. In response to the crisis, many governments took concrete steps. Russia strengthened laws against promoting suicide online, targeting communities that glorified death or encouraged self-harm. India's government pressured internet companies to block access to any blue whale content, while schools launched awareness campaigns urging parents to talk openly with their children about mental health. Brazil and Chile initiated similar crackdowns, combining law enforcement action with public service announcements. In the United States and Europe, schools and community organizations focused on digital literacy, teaching both parents and teenagers how to identify and respond to online threats. Amid these responses, survivors' stories provided important insights. In multiple countries, teenagers who had been contacted by supposed curators came forward to share their experiences. Some described being messaged by anonymous individuals who threatened them with violence or exposure if they refused to complete tasks. Others said the pressure was more subtle, cloaked in friendship or empathy before escalating into manipulation. These accounts confirmed that while blue whale was not always an organized or uniform challenge, dangerous behavior was taking place in scattered online spaces, with predators exploiting the fear and vulnerability of youth. Over time, the blue whale challenge began to fade from headlines, but its legacy endured. By 2018, fewer new cases were being reported, and public awareness campaigns had reduced the novelty of the phenomenon. Yet the story left behind important lessons about the intersection of media, technology, and mental health. It highlighted how quickly rumors can become global truths in the digital age, and how vulnerable populations can be harmed not just by predators, but by the amplification of fear. Perhaps most importantly, it underscored the need for open conversations between parents and children about the risks and pressures of online life. For many families, the tragedy was not just the possibility of blue whale itself, but the realization that their children were struggling silently in the shadows of the internet. Even years later, the phrase blue whale challenge evokes unease. To some, it represents the dangers of unregulated online communities. To others, it serves as a cautionary tale about moral panic and misinformation. The truth lies somewhere in between. There were genuine cases of teenagers manipulated into harming themselves, but the scale was far smaller than headlines suggested. The myth and the reality became entwined, each reinforcing the other until the distinction was blurred. In that sense, the Blue Whale Challenge was not just a story about a dangerous online game. It was a story about how fear spreads, how grief seeks explanations, and how the digital world magnifies both. Today, when experts reflect on blue whale, they often emphasize what it revealed about society's approach to youth, mental health, and technology. The challenge showed how quickly the internet could be weaponized against the vulnerable, but it also revealed gaps in how families, schools, and governments respond to teenage despair. For every story of a predator pushing harmful tasks, there were countless untold stories of young people quietly suffering without support. Blue Whale, in all its tragedy and controversy, forced the world to confront these uncomfortable realities. The final legacy of Blue Whale is thus twofold. On one side, it is a reminder of the real risks posed by malicious actors online, who can manipulate those already struggling. On the other, it is a case study in how myths can magnify tragedies, spreading fear and misinformation faster than facts. The true danger was not only in the tasks or the curators, but in the silence that surrounds teenage mental health. For the families who lost children, no debate over fact versus fiction can undo the grief. For the world, the challenge remains a haunting example of how fragile life can be when despair meets the infinite reach of the internet. If you found this documentary meaningful, subscribe to our channel True Crime Spectrum for more in-depth true crime and digital age investigations. Together, we bring light to the darkest corners of human stories.